Welcome back to our Spiritual Identity series. Each week we've been exploring the importance of understanding who we are, partly as a function of whose we are, but then practically exploring what it means to live into this identity that we have in Christ. So as we kick off this next session, what would you say if I asked, who are you? Many may initially respond with their name, like, I'm Micah. But if I pressed a little further, you may begin to share some details, like where you're from or what you do for a living, maybe something about your family. But in the course of your response, I think you would find yourself sharing a story. The people and the places and the experience that have shaped you, and in the process, your sense of identity. So in this series, we've focused on 4 factors that often reveal misplaced identity. Our insecurities and our idols, maybe family patterns from growing up, and even the wounds that we've received. I think we can agree that if this is all we had, we'd end up with a pretty dismal story. And that's why every week we're turning to God and His Word and allowing Him to inform who we really are. Because apart from that, these environmental factors in our lives can tend to weave themselves into what we would call false narratives. Stories about who we are, about who God is, that are not grounded in truth. And these stories become so familiar and ingrained that we maybe don't even notice they're there. For example, I like to listen to the radio, and the other day I did something that I have not done in a while. I used the scan button to search for radio stations. And in the process, I discovered a station that I didn't know was there. But as I reflected back on that moment, I realized that station has been there all along. I just wasn't tuned into it. And so with these false narratives, our hope and our prayer in this series is that God's Spirit would illuminate, would tune us in to any areas of our lives that need transformation. But speaking of narratives, it's hard to miss that the Bible is really one big story. The story of God's creative and redemptive work in history. At the beginning of this story, Genesis chapter 1, it says that God created the light and the darkness. He created water and separated water to give us what we call the sky. He then gathered the water to reveal dry ground, and that's where we got plants and grass and trees springing up everywhere. He created the sun and the moon and the stars, and then the birds and the fish, and then on day 6, animals, livestock, creatures covering the earth, and then finally, God created man. And so from the beginning of this story, we pick up on some very clear themes. 3 specifically that I want to highlight. The first is that God is the generous provider of everything we need. Imagine arriving on the scene of this story, realizing you didn't do anything to create this. God just said, here it is. And so in addition to being blown away by His generosity, the second theme that emerges in this story is that we're not here to write this story, but to find our place in His story. Which, by the way, I think is why it's called history. But the fact that God created Adam at the end of His creative work means every one of us is hardwired not to ask, how do I make all this, but where do I fit in all this? Why am I here? So God is our generous provider. He is the author of our story. And yet, as we know, God also placed a restriction on Adam and Eve. He said, there's one tree I don't want you to eat from or even touch. And so the third foundational principle of our story is that God can and must be trusted. Meaning there are things that we can't understand that God knows perfectly, which is why He's in charge of the story. But after this opening scene where these foundational principles are established, we know that in chapter 3, everything changes. A new character enters the story, the antagonist, who suggests some rewrites and revisions to God's story. Verse 1 of chapter 3, the serpent asks Eve, did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden? It's interesting, you'll notice that with false narratives, there's often some truth mixed in with lies. See, God did say not to eat, but only of one tree, not any of the trees. And yet, I think in this moment, a seed was sown in Eve's mind that maybe God is not as generous as I thought he was. Well, to her credit, she corrects the serpent. She says, no, God just said it was this one tree. If we eat of it, we'll die. To which the serpent responds, you won't die. God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. So notice, after questioning God's generosity toward Adam and Eve, the serpent then attacks the second foundational principle that this is his story to write. You see, he's essentially saying to Eve, you can be God. You get to define the storyline. You get to make the rules. And with those first two principles undermined, finally, Eve begins to wonder, can God really be trusted? Is he withholding from me? Is he as generous as I thought he was? Maybe he's not sovereign. Maybe I can be like God and I can decide how this goes. And so Eve ate and she shared the fruit with her husband Adam. And verse 7 says, at that moment their eyes were opened. And suddenly they felt the shame of their nakedness. This was a new experience they'd never had. And in this moment, they could have run to God. They could have said, God, we messed up. We're sorry. But the seeds had been sown that God might not be generous with forgiveness. What if God can't be trusted with this mess? What if at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if we ate because we can be like God? So instead of running to God, it says they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. Later on, God calls to Adam and says, Adam, where are you? To which Adam responds, I heard you walking in the garden, so I hid. I was afraid because I was naked. So notice this God who lavished generously on them, who provided all their needs, who wrote them into his story, suddenly was someone who couldn't be trusted, who wouldn't forgive, who they needed to hide from. And tragically, this false narrative has developed and evolved and repeated itself throughout the generations since then, in ways that warp not only our view of God, but our view of ourselves. And so we're going to pause the teaching for a moment to reflect in our small groups on these three foundational aspects of God's original story. And specifically, I want you to discuss in which of these three areas are you most tempted to believe a false narrative? Is it that God is generous and good and will provide everything you need? Maybe it's that this is God's story and he is in charge and it's our job to find our place in that. Or maybe it's the idea that God can't be fully trusted with everything we are, including the mess. Which of these is hardest for you? Take a few minutes in your group, discuss this, and then we'll continue. Well, in the discussion, you probably noticed I referenced fake news. It's a term that's become popular in recent years, but what do we do with fake news? Well, in the political arena, the answer is fact check. So, what does God's word have to say about these false narratives we often believe? I wanted to share two passages that I think serve as a brilliant fact check for some of the twisted narratives we often believe. 1 Peter chapter 2 begins, interestingly, referencing those who don't trust God, who reject his word, who are not building their lives on what he says. But verse 9, in contrast, he says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. As we hear those words, I want you to notice that What we're getting in these verses aren't just some theological facts, but a story. Once upon a time, we were lost. We were not a people. We had no hope. And then God saw our sin. He saw our shame, and he saw our instinct to hide and cover. And what did God do? He extended mercy. He withheld the judgment we deserve. And then he generously lavished upon us this profound, expansive identity. Chosen, royal, holy, special. Guys, this is not just positive self-talk. This is what God says about you and about me. This is the truth. So even here you see these themes from the garden. God is generous and forgiving. We don't need to hide from God. He's purposely writing us into his story. Why? Verse 9 says, to declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. This is his story. This is his glory. And so whatever you do for a living, wherever you've been, wherever you're headed, this is our purpose. To find our unique place in declaring his praise. As Paul says, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do it all for the glory of God. The second passage I want to draw attention to is Ephesians chapter 1, where we find the same themes. Verse 4 says, he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption as sons and daughters through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished on us. So again, we're being brought into the narrative of God's redemptive work, but we're also reminded of these themes from the garden. God is generous. He'll provide everything we need. He's a God who can be trusted to respond to our mess, our sin, our shame, not with judgment, but with forgiveness. He's the one who calls us sons and daughters and writes us into his story. Notice, not when you were born, but verse 4 says, before the creation of the world. God had a plan for you and for me. And in fact, the next chapter in Ephesians says we are his workmanship, created in him to do good works. So this is God's story, but the content of God's story is made up of your life and my life. And the way I think of this is most of us have seen TV shows, right? Made up of multiple episodes. But if you jump into, say, season 4 of a show and watch one episode, are you going to understand the story? You're not. And the reason is because the role of an individual episode isn't to create the story. It's not to come up with the plot. It's to understand where the story's been and then play a unique role in moving that story along. And that's our lives. See, this is God's show, right? And your life is an episode. And I think it's safe to say that some episodes do a better job than others of contributing to the overall story. So the question is, what do you want to be true of your episode? I've noticed that when we're trying to explain an episode to someone, we almost never remember the title of the episode. We say, it's the one where this guy did that thing, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? We're trying to help them understand what we're talking about. And so we're going to take a moment in our process groups, based on everything God says about you, everything we've just read, the things he's put in your heart, the person he's made you to be. We're going to take a moment to talk about how you want your episode to be described. Say at the end of your life, when people are looking back and saying, that's the one where, how do you want them to finish the sentence? That's the one where that person loved Jesus more than anything. They laid down their life to help others. They were bold in developing the gifts God gave them. What would it be for you? I just want to say, have some fun. These can be some serious conversations. Let's dream a little in our groups. And then we'll finish the teaching with what I think is the best part: how to begin addressing these false narratives in our lives. Well, with this last section, I want to share a few thoughts on how to begin confronting false narratives. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 is helpful in this regard. It says, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." In other words, God has a perfect story that He's writing, but the only way that we're going to know our part in it is, first of all, recognize the patterns of the world that we're noticing, but also that are being played out in our lives. The narratives, the themes, the beliefs that were introduced in the garden that can creep into our thinking. And the second thing is how to address these patterns is to be renewed in our mind. And this is so critical because the story you believe will shape the life you live. Now, many might argue the opposite. The life I live has shaped my story, right? And there is some truth to that. But one study after another has concluded that the narrative we tell ourselves determines how we interpret circumstances, which then shapes the way we live in the world. In other words, your life doesn't affect your story as much as your story affects your life. For example, if you see yourself as unlovable, despite what God says about you, you will be more inclined to see people as unloving. I heard a quote recently, "A false narrative is a conclusion in search of an argument." In other words, we have a story with certain presuppositions that we're trying to prove, and we're interpreting all the data in our lives to support that story. But the point Paul's making is transformation starts here. My grandma is 94, and she recently broke her hip and is in a rehab facility, and she was informed that she's not going to be able to move back to her house. Devastating news. But every time I call my grandma, you know what she says? "I can't believe how good God has been to me." The only thing I can figure is that my grandma has a story that interprets difficult circumstances in the light of God's faithfulness and His kindness. And meanwhile, many of us get stuck behind traffic and we get angry, right? It's not the circumstance, it's the story. And so Paul in Ephesians 4 says, "You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, and to be made new in the attitude of your minds." See, we are new. This verse goes on to say we're created in God to be righteous and holy. That's who we are. But the way we live into that new identity is a new attitude. So I don't think it's an overstatement to say, if you change your story, you change your life. If we bring ourselves into God's presence, allow Him to speak and to replace old ways of thinking, we will experience transformation. And I want to reiterate the first step in that succession I just mentioned. Bring ourselves into God's presence. See, it's tempting to try to start with our thinking. I'm going to get control of that, or to work on our behaviors. But the root of our problem is we're trying to live life apart from the author of the story. Paul says in Colossians chapter 1, verse 21, "You who once were alienated from God, hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, He has now reconciled in His body of flesh by His death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before Him." What I want you to notice in that verse is the original problem is separation from God. But that's also the first step toward the solution, is coming back to God. And friends, I just want to note that one of the greatest evidences of religion that is built upon human effort is it reverses this order entirely. Human religion says, change your behaviors, you can change your thinking, and eventually you'll find your way back to God. The gospel flips this absolutely on its head. Come back to God. He will reveal false narratives in your thinking, which in time will lead to changed behaviors that will last. So yes, We're addressing our thinking, but always in the presence and under the authority of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10, Paul says, the weapons of our warfare have divine power to destroy strongholds. But what's the battleground for this warfare? The next verse answers that. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. See, the answer is getting into God's Word, scanning the radio stations, if you will, discovering anything we've not noticed is there before. And then as our story begins to change, our lives begin to change. When we bring those things to Christ, rather than adding those stations to our presets and listening to them day after day, bring them to Jesus. Say, you obey Him. Those insecurities, those idols, those family patterns, those wounds we've received, all of them come under the authority of Jesus to be transformed by the power of the good news. And you know, when I said that the answer to fake news is fact check, I was realizing that biblically speaking, the answer to fake news is good news. It's a God who generously provides everything we need, not the least of which is unconditional love and forgiveness and cleansing. A God who holds nothing back, who sees your shame and mine and invites us not to run and hide, but to come into the light of His healing presence, to come into the presence of community and find freedom. So as we close, I want to invite you back together as a group to discuss a question and then share anything that's emerged for you during this time, where you can pray for each other. God bless you, and I pray that you would experience the presence of the one who is always writing His story and always inviting you and me to find our place in living for the praise of His glorious grace.